one major source of illness, and I'm talking about any kind of illness, whether that's so-called mental illness or physical illness, and that's childhood trauma. And this is true whether I'm talking about anxiety, depression, ADHD, addiction, psychosis, bipolar illness, or if I'm talking about multiple sclerosis, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, colitis, Crohn's disease, ALS, scleroderma, and as I said, malignancy as well. Now that seems like a very bold statement to you, that just about everything, not everything, but just about everything that we call illness is rooted in compensations and adaptations that have to do with childhood trauma. This is from the journal Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the article appeared in their journal 6 years ago now, in February of 2012. And the article is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and here's what they say in their abstract. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, what they're saying is that the adaptations that children are forced to resort to in response to early stress help them endure that early duress and difficulty, but those same adaptations become a source of pathology later on and even threaten longevity. This article I quoted to you from Harvard wasn't published in some fly-by-night alternative publication. It was in a major medical journal. It's like makes no difference whatsoever. And that's why the research is just not incorporated into medical practice, despite the fact that it's been published and it's not even controversial. Well, now let's look at stress. Let's say that you're stressed about something, and you got high levels of cortisol and adrenaline in your system, and you're obsessing about some insult or a loss or something that perturbed you. You're in a high state of stress physiologically, but you're not alone, because a friend of yours sitting next to you says, "Hey, do you want to talk about it? I see that you're upset. Can we talk about it?" What happens to your stress levels? But what if you isolate it? Then you might go on for months stewing in your own stress juices. You got nobody to download it to. No wonder then the women who were stressed and isolated had a much higher risk of breast cancer, which tells us something, that cancer is not the disease of an individual. Cancer is the result of a biopsychosocial process reflecting your lifelong relationships. So there's the physiological, I've been telling you about the physiological stress response. The physiological stress response. But that's not all there is to stress. So stress is really a triad. There's three components to stress. One is the external stressor. That's whatever happens outside you. So that could be a threat, that could be the loss of someone, the loss of a job. So stress is external. Then there's the physiological stress response. happens in the others. So stress then, there's the external stressor, there's the internal physiological response, and in between them, and this is what you've got to work with in your offices, is the what we call the processing apparatus. And the processing apparatus is that person with their particular interpretations and their understandings and their beliefs. So then those are the characteristics. There's automatic concern and regard for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own. Rigid and compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the authentic self or the needs of the self. Repression of anger. And the beliefs that you're responsible for how people feel and that you must never disappoint anyone. Now, the question is, how do these psychological behavioral characteristics translate into physical illness? Well, before I go to the science of it, which has been fairly well worked out, and part of my critique of my own profession is that we just don't look at the evidence. So that we keep talking about evidence-based practice. But I'd love to expunge that phrase from the dictionary because it makes me grit my teeth, because I only wish there was evidence-based practice. So let me illustrate my point with one particular illness that fascinates me because it's A, well known, B, has been the subject of a public campaign in the recent past, and 3, we say that we don't know what causes it, and 4, it's almost always fatal. And I'm talking about ALS, Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis, known in North America as Lou Gehrig's disease. And it's a degeneration, really, of the nerves that activate the muscles that move the limbs and also our breathing apparatus and so on, so that people with ALS, for the most part, become paralyzed, in the end will have trouble breathing and die of respiratory failure. Also, uniformly fatal within 10 years, often much faster than that, except when it isn't, as in the case of the physicist Stephen Hawking, who was diagnosed with it at age 21 and was given 3 years to live and died 53 years later, just earlier this year, in the meanwhile having become the greatest or the best-known scientist in the whole world, which ought to at least make us think that maybe we don't know everything. Not to mention other cases that have actually recovered from ALS. A woman came to me for diagnosis once, not diagnosis, for a second opinion, because she had been diagnosed with ALS, and she'd been told that this will kill her, which it did within a year. How the disease began is that she noticed that she couldn't hold the pen or the chalk in, she was a teacher, couldn't hold the pen or the chalk in her fingers anymore because they would slip through. So how she compensated was to that. And she also began to experience trouble walking. And how she compensated for that was to get up early in the morning, like 5 in the morning, and of course it took her time to get dressed because everything was much slower and clumsier, and she'd get dressed and then drive herself to school, walk into the classroom with her somewhat troubled gait, and then grasp the chalk in her clenched fist and scrawl the day's lesson on the board for the students, teach the whole day, and repeat the performance the next day. And she did that for months, didn't ask for any help, didn't go for a medical opinion, until she could no longer walk. And that's when, now it's an interesting dynamic as to why the husband didn't drag her to the doctor the first day. And that has everything to do with their relationship, which is illustrated by the fact that after they saw me and her condition worsened and it became clear that she would not live, he started to have an affair with another woman, which shows you the relationship they had of his neediness. Physicians would say, with some legitimacy, this is anecdotal, doesn't prove anything. Well, I think anecdotes do prove something if there's enough of them. And it turns out that you'll never read about, meet anybody, look after with ALS who's not like that. And this has showed up in the no matter whose life I read about, no matter what patients I interviewed, my own case studies from palliative care, they were all the same. This difficulty asking for help, this refusal, this dogged refusal to ask for help. Then I looked up the medical literature. And there was a study done at Yale University Medical School quite some years ago now. And what did these researchers find? They found that these patients invariably evoked admiration and respect from all staff who came into contact with them. Characteristic was their attempt to avoid asking for help. Hard, steady work without recourse to help from others was pervasive. There seemed to have been a habitual denial, suppression, or isolation of fear, anxiety, and sadness. Most expressed the necessity to be cheerful. Some spoke casually of their deterioration or did so with engaging smiles. And then I looked up the biography of Lou Gehrig. I knew nothing about the man except that he has this disease named after him. As time passes, fewer and fewer people know about him, but he was a great baseball player, a teammate of Babe Ruth's on the New York Yankees in the 1930s. He was one of the all-time greats. He set a record for a number of hits by a Yankee that was only broken a few years ago. So it really was a durable record. But he set another record that wasn't broken for 70 years either. He never missed a game. Yeah, consecutive games played. And it's not that he was never sick. He got sick like everybody else. He just wouldn't take himself out of the game. It's not that he was ever injured either. At one point his hands were x-rayed, and it turns out that his fingers had been fractured something like 17 separate times. And his teammates would describe him as grimacing like a maddened monkey in agony as he fielded the ball with a broken finger, but he wouldn't take himself out of the game. And yet, on the other hand, when a young rookie on the team got sick with the flu and couldn't play, and the manager was very upset with this young player, Gehrig says, "What are you talking about? He's got a flu, he can't play," and took the rookie to his own home where he lived with his mother. His mother put the rookie into Gehrig's bed. Lou slept on the living room couch while his mom nursed his kid back to health. And that's just exactly, you'll never meet anybody with ALS who's not like that. So the woman with the ALS, the teacher, she was an adopted child. And shortly after the adoption, so you understand, any adopted child has got a deep sense of rejection and abandonment. That just goes with the territory. That doesn't mean we shouldn't adopt kids. It just means that that's a major factor that then we have to really help to heal. And then, shortly after the adoption, the adoptive mother gets pregnant. Now, what do you think the rest of the story is? The adopted child never believes, never perceives that she's loved and appreciated and welcomed and enjoyed like the biological child. And so she develops a coping mechanism. I'll take care of myself, just love me. I don't have any needs, just tolerate me. That's how she survives. Now, remember what I quoted that article from Harvard, that those early coping mechanisms then become sources of pathology later on. Let me give another fact. In the 1930s and 40s, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis, which is a inflammatory degenerative disease of the nervous system, was a 1-to-1. In other words, for every man, there was a woman diagnosed. You know what the ratio now is? It's 3.5 women to every man. Now that immediately tells us, A, it can't be genetic, because the genes don't change in a population over 7 decades or even 10 decades or longer. Number 2, it can't be diet, because that doesn't change for a population. It didn't change more for women than for men, nor can it be the climate. There's something going on. And whatever it is, it can't just be biological. The second point I'm going to make for you is that disease is not a fixed entity. It's a process. And that process is not separated from that person's life. So that how the multiple sclerosis will behave is not simply a characteristic of the disease. It reflects what's happening in the life of that particular individual. Which is, by the way, why we're seeing 3 times as much in women right now, which I'll talk about later. But it's a process. And if it's a process that somehow manifests how we're living our lives, then we can actually perhaps do something about it. Why do I think this gender ratio has burgeoned that way? Because women have always played the role of being the emotional stress absorbers of their environment. So they tend to take on the stresses of their spouses and their families. They still play that role for the most part. But on top of that, since the 30s and the 40s, they've also taken on an economic role. But they have not given up the other role. It's not that they haven't given it up. Society hasn't relieved them of it. The men haven't stepped up, for the most part, to share that emotional burden. So women are still carrying that. But now they got the economic role as well. And they're doing so in the context of less social support, because there's all kinds of reasons why in this neoliberal economy and this stressed culture, people are more and more isolated. So you got more stress, more isolation. Of course you're going to have more autoimmune disease. And so about 75 or 80% of autoimmune disease actually happens to women. Right. Now, there's a condition which is increasing in the population called hypertension, which is to say high blood pressure. And for the most part, about 5% of hypertension cases are secondary. In other words, they're caused by some disease in some other organ, like the kidney, for example, or adrenal gland or something. But for the most part, we call it essential hypertension, which basically is a way of saying that we haven't got a clue what causes it. And what if I told you that the blood pressure of American black males is much higher on the average than that of whites, and they're more likely to develop hypertension, much more likely to develop hypertension? Does that give any clue as to the source of hypertension, maybe? As opposed to their genetic relatives in Africa who don't have high blood pressure at all? And all you have to do is say hypertension a few times, like hypertension, hypertension, hypertension. Anything spring to mind? Maybe there's too much tension in these people's lives. And of course, James Baldwin, the American black writer, famously said that to be an American black male is to live in a state of suppressed rage all the time. The first fact is a study that was done in the United States last year, or I should say 2 years ago now, that showed that the more episodes of racism an American black woman experiences, the greater her risk for asthma. Now, you can't explain that on molecular grounds. You just can't. The racism-induced asthmatic attack, we can see that, obviously, emotional factors must be playing a role here. And not just emotional factors, because the black woman who experiences racism isn't an isolated particle responding to nothing in the environment. She's affected by a social circumstance. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at how you treat asthma, is you give, to open up the airways and to suppress the inflammation that happens in the asthmatic airway, you give inhalers or medications by mouth, which are copies of adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline and cortisol are the stress hormones of the body. I'll talk about them later. They're secreted by the adrenal gland in response to a threat. So there's adrenaline and cortisol. So we're treating asthma with stress hormones. How do we treat multiple sclerosis? If you have a flare-up of your multiple sclerosis, you're going to get an infusion of the stress hormone cortisol. If you've ever been to a dermatologist with a skin flare-up, some kind of chronic psoriasis or eczema, most of the time you're going to get a steroid cream, a copy of cortisol. If you go to a rheumatologist with inflamed joints or connective tissues, guess what they're going to give you? Steroids, cortisol, in all autoimmune diseases. We're treating all these conditions across medicine with stress hormones, but we're not asking ourselves a simple question. Is it possible that stress may have something to do with the onset of this condition? Has something happened to the body's stress apparatus that we have to give people now larger quantities of stress hormone to keep them from having symptoms? Skill testing question. What is the role of the immune system?
Same thing.
It's exactly the same thing. It's to maintain your boundaries, to keep out what is unhealthy, dangerous, unwelcome, allow in what is nutritious and healthy. And the immune system has been called a floating brain. It has memory capacity, it can react, and it can learn, just like the brain. When you're suppressing your emotions, you're suppressing your immune system. And what happens to anger that you suppress? Does it evaporate, go to the moon? What happens to it? Who does it turn against? It turns against you. Now you've got autoimmune disease, where the immune system turns against you, like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis. Hodgkin's is a cancer. So Hodgkin's is a response also to the suppression of the immune system, where the immune system is no longer protecting you. But in the case of autoimmune disease, the immune system actually turns against you. So in the long term, that's what it'll do. In the long term, cortisol will thin your bones, give you osteoporosis. Now, when the Osteoporosis Society does its public education, they talk about sunshine, vitamin D, and weight-bearing exercise. They never talk about stress, which is the most important cause. For example, women who've been depressed are much more likely to have osteoporosis because in depression there's elevated cortisol levels, which thin the bones. And medical ideology is interesting. Ulcers were the one thing where doctors always knew that it had to do with stress. Until 3 or 4 decades ago, where an Australian, very clever Australian scientist found this bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. And now if you give antibiotics to wipe out the bacteria, the ulcer goes away. So there goes the stress theory. Or does it? Because here's a fact that you have to account for. At age 50, 50% of the population will have Helicobacter pylori in their intestines. 50% don't have ulcers. At age 80, 80% will. But 80% of 80-year-olds don't have ulcers. What is it that makes the person susceptible to that bacteria? That's the question. Guess what? It's stress. By the way, there's another mechanism by which stress and early childhood negative experiences lead to disease, which is simply through inflammation. So we know, for example, that the more trauma a child experiences, the greater the level of inflammatory particles in their bloodstream as adults. You can measure inflammatory proteins in the bloodstream, and the more stress you had as a kid, the higher they're going to be. And the more stress you have, there's another structure. I mean, the information is just coming in all the time. It's hard to even keep up with it. There's a structure called telomeres. Telomeres are structures at the end of your chromosomes, like the shoelace has a glue at the end to keep the strands together. Telomeres keep the chromosome together. Telomeres shorten with stress. They also shorten with age. So children who are traumatized, for example, have shorter telomeres, which means that they're chronologically older than their peers. Depression is something I've certainly dealt with in my life. And what I'm really saying to you, and this is, I'm not going to prove this right now, is that virtually everything that happens to us later on in life begins as a coping mechanism in childhood. So, I've talked about these coping mechanisms to maintain our attachment relationships, and so as a result, we suppress ourselves. Now, if you look at the word depression itself, what does it actually mean to depress something? It means to push it down. In depression, something is pushed down. What is usually pushed down in depression? It's anger. And the problem is, when we push down one of our emotions, it's hard to experience the others. And now there's this joyless, negative, hopeless experience of depression, it does begin as a coping mechanism in childhood when the environment could not tolerate your emotions, so you learn to push them down. And then later on, you'll be diagnosed with depression. Now you might ask, am I saying depression is not physiological? Sure it is. But the part of this process is that these early experiences don't only affect our emotions, they also affect our brain physiology. So childhood stresses actually will have an impact on how much serotonin is going to be available in my brain. Serotonin being one of the mood chemicals. So when you take fluoxetine or Prozac, you're elevating your serotonin levels. Now, I am by personality a kind of a depressive, so that's my baseline. You might think this jolly fellow, how could he be depressed? But that's kind of my baseline. That's my default setting. Less and less as I learn to deal with it. But I know that I'm challenged in terms of serotonin. But that does go back to early childhood, because early childhood actually programs the brain physiologically. And as one becomes more self-aware and self-compassionate, you can reverse that. Because those early coping patterns, here's the problem with them. They're meant to be temporary states. We're meant to adopt these patterns. I mean, if you're familiar with my idea about ADHD, which I've been diagnosed with, it's a coping mechanism of young infants. When there's stress around them and they can't escape, fight back, or change the situation, ask for help, they tune out as a way of coping. But then it gets wired into the brain and not goes from a temporary state, which is meant to be, to a long-term trait. And the coping mechanisms become problems when they go from state to trait. There's nothing wrong with her coping that way if she could drop it once she no longer needed to be that way. But of course, that's not how it works. These coping mechanisms are unconscious, therefore they're not chosen deliberately, therefore they cannot be released deliberately either. We're not even aware of them. The problem is that as children, we all face a dilemma. In Australia, there was a study. They looked at 500 women with breast lumps that needed to be biopsied to make sure that it wasn't malignant. And before the results were in, the women underwent a psychological questionnaire. And what they found was that if a woman was emotionally isolated, that by itself didn't increase the chance of that lump being cancerous. If a woman was highly stressed around the onset of that lump, that by itself also didn't increase the chance of that lump being cancerous. But if a woman was emotionally isolated and stressed, the chance of the lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. And the researchers, being medical scientists who think from up here, they couldn't figure this one out, because they said, how does 0 plus 0 add up to 9? If there's 0 effect here, 0 effect there, what's happening? Well, of course, it's obvious. What's happening is, for example, in the front row, person at the very aisle seat here, if you're very stressed and you have these high levels of stress hormones, which are affecting your immune system, and if you're all alone with it for months, you might be in trouble. But if there's a friend of yours sitting next to you and says, hey, friend, hey, sweetheart, hey, buddy, you seem upset, do you want to talk about it? What happens to your stress hormones? Your nervous system relaxes, your heart rate decreases, your intestinal muscles in the gut relax, and your stress hormone levels go way down. We're biopsychosocial creatures. And so these patterns of emotional self-suppression, they promote illness in part because they leave us completely alone. Because whether we're alone or not does not depend on how many friends we have. And again, I'm quoting Bessel van der Kolk. He says, social support is not the same as being merely in the presence of others. The critical issue is reciprocity, being truly heard and seen by the people around us, feeling that we're held in someone else's heart and mind. But if I'm suppressing who I am, nobody's ever going to see me. And I might be very nice, and there might be 1,000 people who love me, but none of them know me. and I'm totally isolated, really at heart. I'll give you one more example, which is actually a British one. It's from the TV series The Crown, which I'm sure many of you have seen. It's a wonderful soap opera about the Windsor family. And as you know, the current Queen's father, King George VI, ascended to the throne in 1936 when his brother Edward abdicated to marry his divorced American sweetheart. His name wasn't George, his name was Albert, Bertie. He did not want to become king. He did not. When his mother, Queen Mary, told him about the coming abdication and that it'd be up to him now to assume the royal throne, he writes in his diary, I'm sorry, when I told her what had happened, I broke down and sobbed like a child, he said. He didn't want to do it. Now, in the Crown, in the TV series, there's a conversation between his mother, Queen Mary, and his wife, the now deceased Queen Mother, Elizabeth. And the mother says, now, of course, he died of cancer. He was a smoker, and he died of lung cancer. There was a British surgeon in the 1960s called David Kiffen who noticed, just like I noticed, and as many physicians have noticed, these patterns in their clients. And he noticed that he was operating on people with lung cancer. And of course, the more you smoke, the greater the risk of lung cancer. Now Bertie, or King George, who became King George VI, was a smoker. But Kissen also noticed that these people also suppressed their emotions, particularly their anger. And he did some studies, and he actually found that the more you suppressed your emotion, the less cigarette smoke it took to trigger the cancer in you. Now, going back to the Crown, so here's the Queen Mother, I should say King George's, Albert's mother, talking to his wife, and she says, the mother says, one can only be thankful for the years one had with him. So wonderfully thoughtful and caring, an angel to his mother, wife, and children. I honestly believe he never thought of himself at all. He really was the perfect son. Want to be the perfect son in the British royal family? Don't think about yourself. Don't think about yourself.
A Canadian study showed that if you were abused as a child, your risk of cancer goes up by nearly 50%. And this is even after you've factored in or factored out things like smoking and drinking, which abused people are more likely to do.
The Globe and Mail, for which I wrote a medical column for a number of years. And these stories from the paper illustrate aspects of what I call the disease-prone personality. The first is a first-person story written by a woman called Donna, who's diagnosed with breast cancer, and she goes to her doctor, and she's describing the experience of the diagnosis. What you need to know is that her doctor's name is Harold, and her husband's name is Hai. Now, Hai's first wife died of breast cancer, and now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. And Donna writes, Harold tells me that the lump is small, and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die, he reassures me. But I'm worried about Hai, I say. I won't have the strength to support him. Now, what's wrong with this picture? So here she is diagnosed with a potentially serious condition. And she's the one who might need radiation, surgery, and or chemotherapy. And the first thought that she has is, how will I look after my husband's emotional needs? So this automatic and compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for disease for reasons that I'm going to tell you. When
you don't get the attention that you needed as a child, as an infant, you'll be consumed by attracting attention. And now you're going to be very attractive. Now, how many times have you passed a mirror without wondering if you're attractive enough? You're just looking for love. If you didn't get the approval that you needed as a child just for existing, just for being who you were, you will want to be winning approval all the time. You'll be a winning personality. If you weren't valued, you want to measure up. If you weren't made to feel special just because for who you were, you might be demanding, in which case you'll run for the leadership of the Conservative Party. If you weren't esteemed for who you were, then you might want to impress people. If you weren't made to feel important for just who you were, then you go to medical school like I did, and you want to make yourself important. If you weren't liked for who you were, you're going to be very nice, so that people will like you, so that you can have this simulacrum of love. If you weren't loved, you'll be very charming. And people say, what a charming guy, what a charming young woman this person is. But all of this demands that you actually suppress your own feelings. Now, how does that lead to illness? It leads to illness because it's very stressful always to be playing a role. It's actually stressful. And there's always the fear behind it. It's fear-driven. And fear is a state of being in stress. Now, the stress hormones, if I were to scream at you right now and frighten you, you would have a stress response. By the way, just to indicate how inseparable the mind is from the body, that's how simple it is. I could change your physiology in this room. I could change the physiology of 1,500 people in this room without touching them, simply by generating a credible threat. If I had a weapon, for example, and screamed at you, your physiology would change in a split second. And obituaries are fascinating because they tell us not just about the person who died, but also about what we as a society value in one another. And what we value in one another is often what kills people. This is a physician who died at age 55 in Toronto. Never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. Now, again, if a friend of yours is diagnosed with a malignancy, is that what you would say to them? Go back to work and keep working until you drop? So there's this rigid and compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the self is another risk factor for illness. Second obituary I'll read you is about a woman called Naomi. This is written by her grateful husband. And she died of breast cancer at age 55. And the husband writes, in her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst she could say was phooey or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. Now, my wife Ray, I think, is in the audience, and we remarried 50 years this year. And believe me, there have been many times when I wished that she would blend in with the environment in an unassuming manner, as I'm sure many of you have who have partners or spouses of any type. But if your partner wants to stay healthy, they will not blend in with the environment. And really what's being described here is the repression of healthy anger. And the repression of healthy anger, we know, suppresses the immune system. This is a man called Sidney. He was the physician, died at age 72 of cancer. Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day as his wife Rosalind and their 4 kids waited for him at home. He would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Never wanting to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney kept having 2 dinners a day for years, until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. And this is presented as a wonderful example of loyalty to the parent. And what is actually being described here is a poor man who suffered from two fatal beliefs. And when I say fatal, I mean literally fatal. One is that he's responsible for how other people feel, and two, that he must never disappoint anybody.
Now, at this point, the question comes up, are we blaming the person for the disease? Are we saying that they're responsible for their illness? The answer is no, and the answer is yes. No, we're not blaming anybody. Yes, they're responsible. But responsible here doesn't mean a sense of blame. It simply means that how they live their lives has a lot to do with their illness. The reason is, and not only that, if we bring in the question of responsibility, we're actually empowering the client. We're saying that you've heard this version before of responsible as response-able. If we're not response-able, then what the heck are we? Then we're victims. So the whole idea is to make people response-able. And for that, they have to be responsible. They have to look at, well, how was I living my life? And how did that contribute to the illness? Why we're not blaming people, though, is because these patterns are completely unconscious. Nobody's aware of it. Nobody decides to be this way. What does it have to do with? Well, for that, you have to go back to childhood in every single case. What I'm saying is difficult for people. People often perceive themselves as being blamed. They're not being blamed, but they perceive themselves as being blamed. And Dr. Christine Northrup, who's a women's physician and best-selling author, I was talking to her, and she said that there's kind of a conspiracy between the doctor and the patient not to talk about such stuff. For the doctor, it's easier to hand out the pill, and it's much quicker. And for the patient, it doesn't bring up uncomfortable questions. But the biggest barrier is actually an emotional one, I think, on the part of physicians. We haven't dealt with our own pain. We haven't dealt with our own stresses. There's a high rate of suicide and depression and burnout amongst doctors. Somebody once said that if you want to start a cult, what do? Well, you give people a uniform, you have special jargon, you isolate them from their families, you subject them to authority and leaders, and you sleep deprive them. In other words, you send them to medical school. It's a stressful thing. And people survive it by shutting. People enter it are like people like me, really driven, and I would have done anything to get into medical school, and to get through it. And so you really are already driven, and then nothing in education prepares you for it. Anything I'm telling you, not a word of this is breathed in any of the medical schools. And then there's the emotional defense of the physician against his or her own pain. Yeah. So these are the factors that I think all go into it. They're social and individual. And by the way, when I said childhood trauma, probably some of you are at least internally shaking your heads because you're looking at your life, and I never had any trauma. But trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And things can happen inside you for which you don't need very dramatic events. But trauma essentially is a restriction of your capacity. It's a limitation. It's a constriction in the body. It's a constriction in your mental capacity to respond in the present moment from your authentic self. Essentially, trauma is a restriction of your authentic self in the present moment. That's what trauma is. Because the day you were born, you were connected to your gut feelings. At some point you learned not to be. Now, why did you learn that? For survival. So a child has two basic needs. The one need is for attachment. Now attachment is as my friend Gordon Neufeld defines it, is the drive, is the biological, psychological, emotional drive for closeness and proximity with another human being for the purpose of being taken care of or for the purpose of taking care of the other. So there's an attachment drive between parents and children, of any species, beginning with birds and upwards. It's the biological drive, to connect for the purpose of being taken care of or to take care of. We can't live without it, and least of all, no creature beyond reptiles can live without it. And least of all can human beings, because we're the most dependent, the most helpless, and the least mature of any creature at birth. So the attachment drive is very, very powerful in our brain, and it explains much of human behavior. Virtually everything that you deal with in your offices relate to disturbances of attachments. And a lot of the people that you see in your offices, they have difficulties because they're still choosing attachment over authenticity, and attachment almost at any cost. And it's killing them on some level. Gut-brain connection. The gut is not just a digestive organ. The gut is actually an immune organ. It's got many immune centers, and the gut is an organ of sensation. Serotonin, the chemical in the brain that we enhance by giving people Prozac for their depression, the gut has more serotonin than the brain does. And so the gut is an emotional organ. Therefore, gut feelings are actually magnifications of impressions that the brain gets, and the gut amplifies them so that you can really know that they're there. And the gut and the brain are totally connected. In fact, the gut sends many more nerve fibers to the brain than the brain sends to the gut. And the brain is reading the internal organs all the time. So there's that connection as well. As traditional science, traditional medicinal practices have always known, you can't separate the mind from the body. You can't actually separate the mind from the body, except in medical school, but not in real life. I was in Fort Francis, Ontario, for a couple of days earlier this week, speaking to mostly native audience, and there's the native medicine wheel with its 4 quadrants of mind and body and emotions and spirit. And they say that for health, you have to have a balance between those 4 quadrants. And traditional shamanic medicinal practices, Ayurvedic medicine of India, the G medicine of China, all the medicine men and women of traditional cultures have always assumed and known about the mind-body unity. They just didn't have the science, but they knew it. Now we have the science, but we no longer know it. Turns out that it's not even that these separate systems are connected together, they're not even separate systems. They're one system with different manifestations. I mean, think about it. First of all, evolution begins with a single-celled organism. That cell then differentiates and becomes a multi-celled organism. But the basic functions of defense, nourishment, and survival have to be carried on by the organism. It's just that now you have different cells that are specialized in certain duties, so that some cells become digestive cells, other cells become brain cells, but they all have the same DNA. And even as human beings, we still begin with one cell at the union of sperm and egg, and then we differentiate and we separate, but that doesn't mean we get disconnected. And so it turns out that the nervous system wires together all these systems. It turns out that it's not even that these separate systems are connected together, they're not even separate systems. They're one system with different manifestations. I mean, think about it. First of all, evolution begins with a single-celled organism. That cell then differentiates and becomes a multi-celled organism. But the basic functions of defense, nourishment, and survival have to be carried on by the organism. It's just that now you have different cells that are specialized in certain duties, so that some cells become digestive cells, other cells become brain cells, but they all have the same DNA. And even as human beings, we still begin with one cell at the union of sperm and egg, and then we differentiate and we separate, but that doesn't mean we get disconnected. And so it turns out that the nervous system wires together all these systems. So there's a part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that is not under our conscious control. So it's autonomic, which is to say autonomous nervous system, you can call it, as opposed to the voluntary nervous system that allows me to snap my fingers if I want to. There's the autonomic nervous system, and that is what innervates our viscera, our heart, our guts, our lungs. It's responsible for the tension of our muscles. The autonomic nervous system connects the brain to the bone marrow, where the red and the white cells are manufactured, and it sends messages from the bone marrow to the brain. It connects the brain to the hormonal glands, to the immune organs, to the spleen, where the red cells are stored, to the thymus, where the white cells mature, and it sends messages from all of these organs back up to the brain. So there's so the nervous system is like a giant electrical grid that wires together all these systems. And the anatomical connections have been worked out. That's one form of connection. The other form of connection, of course, is to the hormones themselves. So the hormones from the hormonal glands in the brain, the pituitary and the hypothalamus, and elsewhere in the body, the gonads, the ovaries, the testes, the thyroid gland in the neck, the adrenal gland on top of our kidneys, adrenal, top of kidney. These all also send secretions, hormones to other organs, and they have an impact on each other. They're constantly talking to each other. That's the second form of connection. The third form of connection is that each of these systems, including the immune cells, can manufacture messenger substances that are circulated through the blood to the other systems. So it turns out that the white cells in your circulation can manufacture every hormone that the brain can manufacture. So the brain is talking to the immune system, and the immune system is talking to the brain. So when something happens in one system, it happens in the other system. But this is rather obvious, actually, when you think about it. It's just that the implications are not obvious to us. So I could clearly and trivially, obviously, change your physiology. I could change the physiology of virtually everybody in this room in a split second. And I could do so without touching you, without giving you any kind of a substance, without in any way physically interacting with you. What would I have to do? I simply would have to utter a piercing, blood-curdling scream and brandish a weapon at you. And your physiology would change like that. Your hormonal gland would start behaving differently, your intestines would stop digesting, your lungs would function differently, your heart would beat faster, your blood vessels would behave differently, more blood would flow to your muscles, there'd be more sugar pouring on into your system so that you could have more energy and you could be ready for flight or fight. Now that's an obvious example, where the emotion changes the physiology in a split second. Well, guess what? That goes on 24/7. So that interaction between the physiology and the emotions is constant. It's just that for the most part, we're not aware of it unless it's dramatic. But that's the only difference. It's no less constant and important.
In 2017, a fellow Canadian physician, Dr. Norman Doidge, also an author, writes about brain and neuroplasticity, said that modern scientific medicine has taken a fundamentally materialist approach, and it is analytical, meaning that it divides wholes into parts. It often proceeds by reducing complex phenomena to their more elementary chemical and physical components, viruses, genes, molecules. And that's how it is. And this isn't a new perception about Western medicine. In 1977, Dr. George Engel, an American physician, internist, and psychiatrist, said that the dominant model of medicine today is biomedical, with molecular biology its basic scientific discipline. And what I'm trying to say to you here is that the critique that I'm going to make tonight of Western medicine and in providing an alternative, it's not new, actually. People have been saying this for a long, long time. So here's George Engels saying that the dominant model of medicine today is biomedical, with molecular biology its basic scientific discipline. It assumes disease to be fully accounted for by deviations from the norm of measurable biological variables. It leaves little room in its framework for social, psychological, and behavioral dimensions of illness. The biomedical model embraces mind-body dualism, the doctrine that separates the mental from the somatic. And let me just give you 3 medical facts here, and you'll see immediately how inadequate and insufficient the Western medical perspective is in explaining these facts that I'm about to give you.
Now, in order to understand the basis of that, we have to consider how we look at human beings, and how we look at disease. Now, Western medicine looks at disease from a particular perspective. And you have to understand something about medicine. It's science, all right, but it's also ideology. And there's a difference between science and ideology. There's a lot of science in it, and it's great science. But there's also ideology. And ideology is a point of view. It's a, as the Germans say, it's a Weltanschauung. It's a worldview that you're not conscious of. That you have hidden beliefs that you don't question. And people that question the hidden beliefs are seen as outliers or mavericks. And that's an ideology. And that exists in all realms, whether politics or science or medicine or history or economics or any field of human thought or investigation. So there's always ideological biases hidden in any system. Well, the hidden biases are, number one, that diseases have either physical causes in the sense of genes or external forces like bacteria or viruses or toxins, or we don't know what the causes are. So the causes are either physical or the disease is what we call idiopathic. We don't know what the source of it is. So that's one bias, is that cause. The second bias is that diseases happen to organs. So you have heart disease, and you have lung disease, and you have disease of the connective tissue or the liver or whatever. And then there's specialties designated to study in depth the diseases of these organs. But that, except for obvious lifestyle, so-called lifestyle proclivities like smoking or drinking, we don't really think that the life of an individual has a whole lot to do with the disease of the organ. So, cancer strikes somebody who doesn't smoke. We don't know what causes it. So we separate the organ from the whole person. And then we separate the person from the environment, so that the social environment, we might acknowledge the role of the physical environment, but we certainly not acknowledge the role of the social environment. I mentioned that I worked in family practice for 32 years, 12 of them with hardcore drug addicts, the other 20 in a straightforward family practice where I helped to deliver a lot of babies, and in palliative care where I helped a lot of people die, and everything else in between. And in those years, I found that the people who got sick and didn't get sick, they had certain patterns, certain characteristics that kept cropping up over and over and again until I just couldn't ignore it anymore. And there's a significant difference between an experience between a family physician and a specialist, in that the specialist certainly does know, and blessedly so, a lot about a certain organ and a certain system, but they don't know the patient. And by the time they see the patient's already sick, and usually they already have a diagnosis. At least we know what area the disease is. As the family physician, you get to see people before they get sick. So you know what their personalities are like for years before they get sick. And also you get to see them in the context of their families, including their multi-generational family of origin.
And so George Engel, in 1977, called for what he termed a biopsychosocial approach for medicine. And the boundaries between health and disease, between well and sick, are far from clear and will never be clear because they're affected by cultural, social, and psychological considerations. That was 1977. And that wasn't new either. In 1940, another American physician said that social and psychic features play a role in every disease, but in many conditions they represent dominant influences, and that mental factors represent an active force in the treatment of patients as active a force in the treatment of patients as chemical and physical agents. And that wasn't new either, because back in Roman times, the Greek physician Galen already pointed out that women who are depressed are more likely to have breast cancer. And now we have the actual studies to show why, and I'll refer to them later. So what I'm saying is that this awareness, this intuitive awareness that you can't separate the mind from the body, and you can't separate the individual from the environment, is not new in medicine. What is new is that now we have the science to actually prove it. And what is remarkable and lamentable at the same time is that despite the scientific evidence, medical practice still doesn't take into account. In Britain, in London, presenting at the Breath of Life conference, and one of the co-speakers was the great trauma psychiatrist, my friend of mine, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And Bessel says in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, our culture teaches us to focus on personal uniqueness, but on a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. Our brains are built to help us function as members of a tribe. And that's not new either, because if you go back 2,500 years to the Buddha, the Buddha talked about what he called the interdependent co-arising of phenomena. And he said that every phenomena arises in relationship to every other phenomena. You can't separate anything from anything else. And so the perspective I will propose here for you is that biopsychosocial perspective. And from that perspective, illness is not an entity in itself. It is actually the manifestation of a person's life in a certain context, to which many factors contribute, but the psychological cannot be separated from the physical, and the physical and the psychological aspects of the individual cannot be separated from his or her social connections and existence, and therefore from the culture that they live in. And if we're going to be fully inclusive about human beings, I'll have to bring in another dimension, which of course is heresy in medical terms, which is the spiritual one. And so basically, we're biopsychosocial spiritual creatures. And spiritual simply means that there's more to us than the little ego that many of us are hung up on, and which rules this particular society. We're biopsychosocial creatures. And so these patterns of emotional self-suppression, they promote illness in part because they leave us completely alone. Because whether we're alone or not does not depend on how many friends we have. And again, I'm quoting Bessel van der Kolk. He says, social support is not the same as being merely in the presence of others. The critical issue is reciprocity, being truly heard and seen by the people around us, feeling that we're held in someone else's heart and mind. But if I'm suppressing who I am, nobody's ever going to see me. And I might be very nice, and there might be 1,000 people who love me, but none of them know me. And I'm totally isolated, really at heart. And that's what's going on. And from that perspective, illness is not just meant to be battled. It's meant to be come to terms with, understood, inquired into as to what its message is. And from that perspective, illness is a potential teacher. And that invites and actually necessitates an inquiry.
So I'm going to read you a quote from one of my favorite teachers. And unfortunately, as much as I've told you, there's so much I haven't told you. Well, here's a quote I like from Susan Griffin, who says, because we think in a fragmentary way, we see fragments. And this way of seeing leads us to make actual fragments of the world. But the quote I wanted to give you was by Almaas, otherwise known as Hamid Ali, who said that your conflicts, all the difficult things, the problematic situations in your life are not chance or haphazard. They're actually yours. They're specifically yours, designed specifically for you by a part of you that loves you more than anything else. The part of you that loves you more than anything else has created roadblocks to lead you to yourself. You're not going to go in the right direction unless there's someone pricking you in the side telling you, look here, this way. That part of you loves you so much that it doesn't want you to lose the chance. It will go to extreme measures to wake you up. It will make you suffer greatly if you don't listen. What else can it do? That is its purpose.